Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting International Carnivorous Plant Society's webinar. My name is Kenny Coogan. I'm the Education Director, and we like to host at least one webinar a month. And starting for 2025, we have Noah Juve. We're going to be talking about the Drosera petiolaris complex and about a trip that he took, which we're very excited about. And I just wanted to briefly tell you that the ICPS is a group of about 1,400 paid members. We are undergraduate students, all the way up to college professors, researchers, conservationists, backyard growers. We welcome everyone. And we have many webinars coming up and many things happening in 2025. The next webinar is going to be in February, and it's going to be on the effects of historical fire suppression on Venus flytrap populations. Because, as Noah might know, there's a whole field of study about fire ecology and how important fire is to carnivorous plants. The first Wednesday of May every year is World Carnivorous Plant Day, and in this year, 2025, it is the 5th anniversary of World Carnivorous Plant Day. You can go to our YouTube channel and see all of the past World Carnivorous Plant Day videos. I like to post at least 24 a year, one every hour, for that day to celebrate all things carnivorous plants. Noah, of course, has done a video for us, as well as many other people. And to celebrate the 5th anniversary in the year 2025, we are looking for videos that have to do with the number 5. So like 5 tips on growing Drosera petiolaris, or 5 places in the world to see Drosera petiolaris, or 5 carnivorous plants that you can find in Florida, or 5 tips on how to grow nepenthes on a windowsill, or 5 ways to feed carnivorous plants. So that's the theme, just the number 5. It could be about conservation or cultivation. If you're interested in presenting for World Carnivorous Plant Day, please send me an email at kenny@carnivorousplants.org. Or if you're interested in presenting a monthly webinar, you can also send me an email there. And with that, Noah's going to do a great presentation. If you're attending this live, thank you so much. And if you have questions for Noah, you can type them into the chat box below. And I will read all of the best ones to him at the end, so people who are watching this as a recording know what we're talking about. And Noah, you can share your screen now. And thank you so much, everyone who attends this live. And thank you, Noah, for
Today, I'm going to be giving a hopefully brief taxonomic overview of Drosera section Lasiocephala, which is synonymous with the Drosera petiolaris complex. So first, a little bit about me. My name is Noah Juve. I reside in Washington State, USA. So not the west side of Washington, like the nice and humid and mild Seattle, but the very extreme eastern side, kind of just on the border of the drier lowlands and the very, very cold Okanagan highlands. So we get very, very hot summers and very, very cold winters. I am currently studying the Drosera of remote northern Australia with a specific focus on Drosera section Lasiocephala, which is the petiolaris complex. And it is one of 2 Drosera sections with major diversity in this region of Australia, the other being Drosera section Arachnopus, also known as the Drosera indica complex. Another interesting fact is that my expeditions are entirely self-funded through the operation of my small nursery online, which is currently under the name Insecticide Nursery. So I am not at the time actually associated with any formal academic institution to conduct my work, and I'm more of just a carnivorous plant enthusiast who has gone rogue. I started cultivating carnivorous plants close to a decade ago, and for the last, I don't know, maybe 6 years, I've been very keen on finding them in the wild. And I think this is the most interesting aspect of carnivorous plants by far. A little bit of an issue there, but before we get into the taxonomy of this group, I think there's a few terms that we should briefly overview to get an understanding of the plant anatomy. These terms will be used quite extensively in the upcoming slides. So Drosera section Lasiocephala, the main body plan or rosette structure of the plant consists of lamina, which is this leaf stalk, and it is non-carnivorous, and it is sometimes quite glabrous and other times very, very densely hairy with this Drosera vulva we see from Kakadu National Park. And this is actually known as the Kakadu hairy form of Drosera vulva, and it is indeed a vulva relative rather than a ordensis relative, which with which it bears superficial similarity. Drosera ordensis was the plant that I showed in the first photo of this presentation, and note that those species are only superficially similar, so totally unrelated, and a very interesting example of convergent evolution, which we see quite a bit in the petiolaris complex. So born from the leaf stalk is the lamina, which is the carnivorous or trapping portion of the petiolaris complex. So this is the leaf blade. So usually the lamina to, normally the petiole to lamina ratio is quite large, which is actually how the type species of this section, Drosera petiolaris, collected in Queensland in the 1800s, got its name. So the stem, I think it's also noteworthy to consider that all taxa of Drosera section Lasiocephala have stems. So sometimes this is very, very reduced in size and internode length. As in the case of many Drosera dilatata petiolaris, Drosera falconeri, Drosera cornelii, but all of these species do have stem tissue. And other times, it is very, very elongated, as we see with Drosera banksii, Drosera subtilis, and some forms, or I guess they're currently called forms, of Drosera paradoxa, including Drosera paradoxa type from Western Australia. So a very interesting thing to also note here is that you see these kind of alternating patterns on the stem. So you see this very compact, spiky ring of old leaves, which was produced during the dry season of Northern Australia. And this other mostly barren section of leaves, which was produced during the wet season. So by that, we are able to determine that this specimen is quite old. So it has been around for many years, just slowly inching around on these white sand flats that you get in a lot of the sandstone-associated areas of Kakadu National Park. And another very interesting aspect of this is that the old stem portions are completely dead, and they'll eventually blow away in the wind. So you see the stem is actually fractured right here. So this stem is completely dead. That is doing nothing. It was fractured right here. So who knows if there was, well, there probably was an older stem, but it's no longer there. So we really don't know how old this specimen is. It's almost certainly a decade old, if not older. So I think the concept of this almost like Lovecraftian being inching across the hellscape of Northern Australia, consuming insects, is just such a amazing concept. And there's really nothing more metal than nature. But all petiolaris complex Drosera have roots, of course, the majority of which are adventitious. So these roots are produced along the length of the stem and mainly serve to just anchor the plant in soil. This root is obviously dead because it is attached to this dead portion of the stem here. So it is no longer live, and the live roots almost certainly occur below this living part of the stem here, which is this living stem portion probably begins under this shaggy growth of old dead petioles, and then the active apical bud of that growth point is right there. So I also think it is very important to go over inflorescence anatomy, because this is a very diagnostic feature of Drosera section Lasiocephala, especially when you see so much convergence among the rosettes, and it would be almost impossible or very difficult to distinguish Drosera fulva from Drosera ardensis based exclusively on those very hairy rosettes shown in the other slide. But the species have very, very completely different inflorescence structure, which is a very, very taxonomically relevant feature of this section. So we here have the peduncle, which is essentially the central axis of the inflorescence, as well as the pedicel, which is sort of the fruit stalk, and then fruit, of course, with the sepals covering it. The sepals collectively constitute all petiolaris complex Drosera have 5 sepals, 5 petals. The sepals collectively constitute the calyx. The petals collectively constitute the corolla of this plant. So this inflorescence we see right here actually belongs to a putative hybrid of Drosera brevicornis and Drosera dilatata petiolaris found in the Kimberley. So pretty interesting to see it blooming at a fairly unusual time of the year, because this one was photographed in late May. So a bit of flower anatomy, not going to be as important, but I still think it is worth reviewing. And this might be review of high school biology for some. But the stigma is the female portion, the female receptive portion of the flower. It is born from the style arms, and the stigma and style arm collectively constitute the style. We have anther and filament collectively constituting the stamen. Anther is obviously the pollen or male reproductive part. And then we have our petals here, and we have our sepals, which are quite hairy, you can see, and hairy sepals are very, very common among the Drosera petiolaris, although a few unusual taxa do display glabrous sepals, which will be discussed more in depth later in this presentation. So here are our 16 described taxa of Drosera section Lasiocephala. They are not arranged in, well, they are arranged in a particular order, but this order does not correlate with description dates or anything of that nature. So starting from the top, Drosera subtilis and Drosera banksii are a couple weirdos of the group, with special emphasis on subtilis as being a weirdo. These 2 taxa are notorious for kind of defying preliminary categorization based exclusively on morphological characters, because for many people, for many years, people thought they were actually tuberous Drosera, but they don't have tubers, so people thought they were tuberous Drosera. But that is actually not the case at all. They are firmly within section Lasiocephala, or basal to Lasiocephala, and yeah, just very unusual plants. And Lasiocephala is actually sister to section Brastrum, and section Brastrum is pygmy Drosera, which we can see in Fernando's beautiful phylogeny here, in which woolly sundews, the informal term for Drosera section Lasiocephala, is sister to Drosera section Brastrum, which is the pygmy Drosera. And these two, along with the tuberous Drosera, as well as D. binata, collectively constitute this monophyletic clade that very likely radiated out of Southwestern Western Australia, with the only members not having the majority of their diversity present in Southwestern Western Australia being Drosera binata and Drosera section Lasiocephala, the petiolaris complex. And Drosera binata actually does have a one species in Southwestern Western Australia. And I'd be very interested to see through a phylogeny whether the Western Australian Bonata is basal to the conglomerate of Eastern taxa, which we see with multifeted dichotoma, various other exciting things like that, or if it is somehow went from Eastern Australia to Southwestern Western Australia as kind of an inverse of the migration Drosera pygmea took from Southwestern Western Australia to Southeastern Australia. So in summary, long way is that this group radiated out of Southwestern Western Australia, very likely. And also Drosera ligera is mostly Southwestern Western Australia. It's a very, very unusual species. Then next on our species list, we have Drosera paradoxa, which is actually part of a very, very large complex of species, mostly native to Western Australia, only one of which is described currently, but many we are working on the descriptions of, but it still requires a great deal of further study. This species has the paradoxic complex has the majority of its diversity in the Kimberley region, which is kind of this northern region of Western Australia. Then we have Drosera caduca, which I sort of wanted to place within this group highlighted green as the Drosera dilatata petiolaris group, but I know I have this terrible certainty that Drosera caduca is not in fact a dilatata petiolaris relative, despite its long erect pedicels. Its distribution makes no sense. It's mostly native to Prince Regent National Park, which is pretty far western Western Australia, and this is where we also see a lot of not dilatata petiolaris diversity, Drosera paradoxic complex diversity. There's a great number of paradoxic complex species known, or undescribed species known from Prince Regent National Park. So I think that caduca could potentially be sister to possibly this next group we have down here, which is the Drosera derbiensis group, and it consists of 3 described species so far, closely allied in their long inflorescences, their erect, strongly alternating pedicels, and erect to semi-erect. Sometimes you see them oriented perpendicular to the inflorescence, but a feature that a lot of people actually gloss over with these is that a lot of times they are strongly alternating. So with a lot of previous assessments of inflorescence structure within Drosera section Lasiocephala, we see great emphasis placed on pedicel orientation rather than positioning on the inflorescence. So as we will see in the following slides, the positioning is also quite a diagnostic character to separate groups. And this species has its diversity radiating out of the west. So Brumensis is endemic to the Dampier Peninsula, which is actually right up here. And Alan Lowry, who described, I think, most of the petiolaris complex species, was not an incredibly creative botanist or taxonomist in his naming. So we get a lot of Brumensis, derbiensis, ordensis, which just reference a geographic location. So Drosera brumensis is endemic to this Dampier Peninsula here, and it is one of the few petiolaris complex species that is isolated by almost exclusively geography. So that is quite noteworthy. And something I will discuss later. Next, we have the Drosera dilatata petiolaris group, which consists of Drosera cornelii and Drosera falconeri, as our only 2 described species that I feel comfortable lumping into this informal grouping. And both, falconeri is endemic to the Northern Territory, so the area around Darwinish, kind of the Howard River Sand Plains and a bit south, and Drosera dilatata petiolaris is quite widespread. It is native to the Northern Territory. We even have records from Eastern Arnhem Land, which is this area, kind of Eastern Northern Territory up here, as well as fairly far west in the Kimberley. So Drosera dilatata petiolaris, quite a confusing species. It is very widespread in the Kimberley, but it is distinguished by its small inflorescences and erect pedicels. These, the above species that I have highlighted in red, have very long inflorescences. And Drosera cornelii actually has a split distribution. It was the type specimen collected not by Alan Laurie, or maybe it was collected by Alan Laurie, but it wasn't discovered by Alan Laurie. But it was, regardless, it's from the Mitchell Plateau of actually Western Australia, the Kimberley region, which is about here-ish. And it was later found to also occur in the top end, kind of around Darwin. And the question of whether these are truly cornelii or kind of convergence, or who knows? I'll say that, who knows? And then next we have the Drosera darwinensis group. And now we get out of erect pedicel territory and into pendulous pedicel territory. And not only pendulous pedicel, well, actually, I can't say that because Drosera darwinensis sensu stricto does have somewhat alternating pedicels, but Drosera burmensis, which also has pendulous pedicels, has pedicels arranged in a very linear column, downward facing on the inflorescence. And something I didn't mention in the above Drosera dilatata petiolaris group is that the majority of species from this group are known from the Northern Territory. So there are more Drosera species related to Drosera dilatata petiolaris, namely the plant that Alan Laurie called Aph petiolaris pincushion, as well as the plant Alan Laurie called Aph petiolaris entiform, but these are actually not remotely related to petiolaris sensu stricto, which is endemic to Queensland, but instead very clearly related to Drosera dilatata petiolaris with their erect pedicels. But the diversity of our Drosera darwinensis group, we see a lot of species in Northern Territory, but we don't. I'm not really certain where this group might have radiated from, because common trend that you'll see with Drosera section Lasiocephala is that it is so incredibly understudied. So we don't know very much at all about the distributions of these species. There's giant gaping holes in Arnhem Land where there are zero botanical records for not only petiolaris complex Drosera, but anything. So we just need more people going out and finding these plants and seeing where they occur before we can make more taxonomic sense of this group. I am of the opinion that there's probably a species count in Lasiocephala that is close to that of sister section Bryastrum, the pygmies in Southwestern Western Australia, but we only have 16 described. And the majority are undescribed, and we just don't know enough about them yet from field research to do a remotely good job of describing them. So much more field work is required. Then next we have Drosera fulva, which is probably sister to the Drosera darwinensis group, and it has some similarities with Drosera brevicornis. Namely, it has very erect, long, woolly peduncle, or inflorescence in general, I suppose, and very pendulous, short peduncles. And then we have highlighted in orange our Queensland endemics, which currently consist of Drosera petiolaris, Drosera lanata, as well as the recently or somewhat recently described Drosera stipularis. And Drosera stipularis, very unique species endemic to these extremely harsh white sand habitats. And all of these are endemic to Queensland. They have pendulous pedicels, interestingly, but they usually do not have long scapes like Drosera brevicornis and Drosera fulva do. And there's more undescribed species from Queensland too. There's actually undescribed species from all of these groups. Very likely the only one that is dubious is perhaps the Drosera derbiensis group, because we are not yet certain whether or not a southern taxon is truly distinct from Drosera derbiensis. But one theory I would like to propose today about how these species relate to each other is a migration northeast from where this phylogenetic clade we see here originated, or at least diversified, in southwestern Western Australia. So it is quite clear that the petiolaris complex branches off from the pygmy Drosera, and it has to venture north. So I think there's good evidence to support that the species moved northward along the west coast, and the early splits occurred in the Western Kimberley region. Furthermore, I would like to propose that Drosera brumensis is a morphologic and possibly genetic link between the Drosera derbiensis group and the Drosera paradoxa group. So you see some quite unusual characters in Drosera brumensis. The plants sometimes like to form little stalks. They have very narrow petioles, and most importantly, they have consistently glabrous sepals. This is a very unusual character for section Lasiocephala, as no other taxa of Lasiocephala, outside some unusual stem-forming ones, including Drosera paradoxa, sensu lato, as well as Drosera subtilis, have very truly glabrous sepals. So then once the early splits occurred in the west and the species were pushed eastward towards suitable habitat and radiated in the top end region of the Northern Territory, as well as Queensland. So getting on to some species photos, here we have Drosera brumensis. This was photographed on the Dampier Peninsula here, which we can see circled in red here, the general area. So all of these photos may not be from a specific single site, but they are from the same general region. And when these pictures appear in the bottom corners of the screen, changing, you can assume that I've changed the location with that I've been viewing photos, that I've been showing photos from. And the previous photos before that are all from the same general region. So Drosera brumensis here, we have a plant, and it's blooming, and it blooms fairly late, actually. So I was able to find some specimens blooming in early June. So that is quite unusual for petiolaris complex species, but still something you see in Drosera brumensis, and notably some Drosera paradoxa complex species. And another interesting fact is that Drosera brumensis, the inflorescence of this species are quite strongly ascending. So they kind of attach at a strong curve down here, which again we see in the majority of Drosera paradoxa complex taxa, although the majority of these are undescribed, and Drosera paradoxa type is actually one of the few that does have an erect peduncle attachment. So Drosera brumensis, we don't see any clear hairs on the pedicels or central axis, and as well as the sepals, of course. And these inflorescences are often held at an angle, and they are not very erect like you see with Drosera brevicornis and Drosera fulva. So here we have a rosette of Drosera brumensis entering dormancy of sorts. So you can see glabrous, very glabrous petioles, as well as the new dry season leaves being produced very dry. So it is closely related to Drosera derbiensis, which has similar narrow petioles, but Drosera derbiensis very rarely has this very glabrous surface to the leaves, a daxial surface at least. Then here we have an inflorescence in which we can see quite clearly the glabrous or hairless sepals. And the peduncle actually often has very, very small hairs, but is mostly glabrous. Alan Lowry said that both the sepals and peduncle of Drosera brumensis were glabrous, but this is actually not true, as during the dry season, you can quite clearly see hairs on the peduncles of this species. Now here we have a flower. Only white petals are currently known from the diversity of Drosera brumensis, which is quite an interesting fact and hints at some degree of isolation genetically from the rest of the group, because usually only white petals are seen in those species that do not often interact with the others, because there's a very high degree of hybridization and introgression occurring with wherever Drosera section Lasiocephala taxa come within close proximity of each other. So here we have one of the little brumensis stalks. This plant is quite dormant, but we can still very clearly see a strongly ascending thick peduncle with small white hairs. So again, not completely glabrous, but this plant is quite dormant. And these specimens do not usually get very tall, because once the rosette reaches too far off the ground, the plants cannot survive the dry season and they die. So other species like Drosera, Apfulva from Kakadu that I showed earlier, inch across the ground decumbently rather than erect vertical columns. Now here we have Drosera derbiensis. I continue to move eastward. I am no longer on the Dampier Peninsula and kind of south of the Yampi Sound. And Drosera derbiensis has narrower leaves than Drosera rodensis, but wider than Drosera derbiensis. In many respects, is an intermediate between these two taxa. Most importantly, it's quite a bit hairier than both Drosera brumensis, as well as the paradoxic complex species, of course, and quite similarly hairy to Drosera ordensis, and even the older wet season leaves are not as hairy as those you see of Drosera brumensis. Now here are the here's the inflorescence of Drosera derbiensis, in which we see not only slightly shorter peduncles, but slightly shorter pedicels, but also very densely hairy pedicels. Very densely hairy sepals. Although that does apply to the pedicels as well, and you see hairs on the central axis as well. So another Drosera derbiensis specimen producing an inflorescence. Drosera derbiensis and Drosera brumensis both bloom kind of sporadically throughout the year as moisture permits. Quite unusually, this region experienced some quite unseasonal rainfall during my visit. So usually you do not see them blooming at this time of the year, which also correlates to this specimen, which is actually emerging from dormancy because the Western Kimberley experienced quite a bit of rainfall in the early dry season. So these plants are capable of emerging from dormancy, flowering for a few weeks, and then retreating to dormancy again. So you do not see this with tuberous Drosera, really. Like Drosera erythrorhiza is not capable of briefly emerging, flowering en masse, and then retreating again, as petiolaris are. So very interesting adaptation, quite noteworthy of the historic climate of this region. Now here we see Drosera rodensis, which is closely allied with Drosera derbiensis and Drosera brumensis. And most notably, we see pedicels that are long and strongly alternating. So you see one comes off to one side and then one comes off to the other side, and so on. And these inflorescences are very often floppy, kind of going all over the place. The inflorescences of Drosera brumensis are held extremely erect, versus they're very often floppy in Drosera brumensis, Drosera derbiensis, and Drosera rodensis. Now here we see a rosette of Drosera rodensis exhibiting the beautiful dendritic white hairs, quite characteristic of the species, and some equally beautiful dewy red lamina. And note the petioles are quite wide, and there are some comically wide-leaved specimens of Drosera rhodensis that occur both in kind of the closer to the Carnivorous area around like Kingston Rest, as well as north of Columbaroo, which I had the pleasure of discovering this year. So another view of Drosera rhodensis in which we see these strongly alternating and erect to semi-erect, often perpendicular to the central axis pedicels. So a horde of them blooming around Kununurra. Kununurra is in the Eastern Kimberley, and I had the opportunity to visit the Eastern Kimberley during my trip last year, which experienced actually quite a bit of rainfall. It was one of the wettest wet seasons on record for that region, which probably accounts for the very high number of inflorescences produced per plant by these Drosera rhodensis specimens. Now here we have Drosera brevicornis, which actually these exact specimens were photographed from Kakadu National Park, which is the type location for the species, although it does have distributions around the Howard River sandplains of Darwin, as well as in Northern Territory, most prominently on the Mitchell Plateau, as well as kind of the area south of Columbaroo, Theta Station around there. And most notably, Drosera brevicornis has pendulous pedicels. So it has and they're arranged in a linear column. So you do not see them alternating very strongly as you do with Drosera rhodensis. You see them arranged in a very linear column, very, very woolly and short. For example, the sepals are almost always longer than the pedicels of Drosera brevicornis. And you see some stylidium in the background, and stylidium are often companion plants of petiolaris complex Drosera in the wild. So another photo demonstrating the pendulous pedicels of Drosera brevicornis. Now here we go to we remain in Kakadu National Park actually, and we see another photo of Drosera affulva Kakadu hairyform. So again, the superficial similarity to Drosera rhodensis is merely that, superficial, because the hairy petioles evolved completely convergently. The inflorescence almost exactly matches that of Drosera affulva sensu stricto, which was collected around Darwin. Notably, however, the D. fulva sensu stricto has almost completely glabrous petioles during the wet season, at least. So here we see the habitat of Drosera affulva Kakadu hairyform. So this is incredibly harsh. It's this sandy hellscape. It gets very, very hot, and the plants just thrive in here. And no other petiolaris complex Drosera in the region colonize these habitats to the extent of Drosera affulva Kakadu hairyform. Meanwhile, in slightly wetter depressions, within meters of those white sand exposed dry patches in which you find Drosera affulva Kakadu hairyform, you find the very, very common Drosera delicata petiolaris, which has very short inflorescences bearing erect pedicels. So Drosera dilatata petiolaris colonizes these flat, peaty, grassy seepages, unlike Drosera affulva Kakadu hairyform, which specializes in those white sand, very exposed habitats. And you could see it growing sympatrically with Drosera bermanii here. So there is, however, a degree of overlap between the tolerances of Drosera affulva Kakadu hairyform and Drosera dilatata petiolaris. So each one of these species has a range of environmental tolerance, and these overlap. So sympatry in zones of, or sympatry in zones of environmental overlap results in rampant gene flow between species. So here we have a hybrid between Drosera dilatata petiolaris and Drosera fulva kakadu hairyform, and it is displaying perfectly intermediate characters between these species. And hybrids between taxa of Drosera section Lasiocephala display intermediate characters and not only resent morphology, but also inflorescence morphology, which is probably strongly implied. And I made a quite interesting graph here to kind of help describe my observations at these sites. So when habitat type is represented linearly, which is very much an oversimplification, in which on the far left we see very, very dry, too dry for even Drosera fulva to colonize. And then on the far right, we see too wet, wetter than what dilatata petiolaris can colonize. Then the fulva niche is represented at approximately the peak of the green, and green represents fulva, orange represents hybrids, blue represents dilatata petiolaris, and yellow represents both. So at the peak of Drosera fulva niche, we see plant frequency is primarily fulva. But as we descend into wetter, peatier soils, we start getting a mix. So we see fulva, then sympatry between pure species, which correlates with hybrid occurrences. So hybrids are most prevalent in zones of environmental overlap because species coherence among Drosera section Lasiocephala is largely maintained by those ecological factors. So without those ecological factors, species coherence becomes less coherent. So this trend continues, and in the middle here, we see both occurring as well as many hybrids. And then as you start to get closer to the preferred dilatata petiolaris niche, the number of hybrids and number of sympatry zones diminishes, and you see just more dilatata petiolaris until it starts getting too wet for even dilatata petiolaris, and the plant frequency decreases. So here's a bit of a funny slide that I included. We began to venture back west around Darwin for the Howard River sandplant species, in which we find Drosera fulva sensu stricto. And I had the fantastic opportunity of collaborating with Thilo Kruger on many of my trips around here, and we were able to review some of the Darwin herbarium together. And I just did note the rarest Australian creature of all, a wild tilo. So here we have an overlap site between three taxa. So you could see it is a bizarre mess of plants. This habitat falls within the environmental tolerance of Drosera dilatata petiolaris, the plant known as Drosera petiolaris NT form, which is actually a dilatata petiolaris relative, as well as Drosera fulva sensu stricto. And species coherence is maintained largely by geography, ecology, and phenology. In overlapped Goldilocks zones between the tolerances of species, rampant integration also often results in a spectrum of morphologically intermediate taxa, bridging the gaps between our concepts of these pure species. The evolutionary strategy of Drosera section Lasiocephala very much parallels that of Nepenthes, excluding N. Pervelii, which I guess you might find similar to Drosera brumensis in being a quite relic basal lineage that branched off very, very early, got stranded in the Seychelles, closely followed by Drosera madagascariensis and Drosera missolensis, if you consider that a valid taxon. Then you get a lot of other basals like Cassiana, Distillatoria, stuff in that area. But the trend is, as you venture southeast, the newest taxa are southeast, so the most basals are in the northwest. And I think this is an interesting note to kind of how it reflects what I was saying earlier about the early branching occurring in the west for Drosera section Lasiocephala. Drosera fulva sensu stricto notably has glabrous sepals. So yes, this is currently considered the same species as Drosera afulva kakadu hairyform, but that species requires a lot more study before it can officially be described. Now here we see the diagnostic stamen hooks, supposedly of Drosera brevicornis, visible on Drosera fulva sensu stricto around Darwin. So there's another feature that corroborates the close linkage between Drosera brevicornis and Drosera fulva type, in addition to the pendulous pedicels, which we see here, and very erect inflorescences. Speaking of which, we see here. So again, the inflorescences are fairly similar to Drosera brevicornis. Actually, the hairs are not quite as long, but the pedicel orientation is quite similar. And inflorescence morphology is extremely consistent between individuals at sites with minimal hybridization. This is a site which consists almost exclusively of Drosera fulva, and we see a giant just field of these spent inflorescences, held erect, semi-erect, even in depth, which is quite a notable feature of this species, as well as Drosera brevicornis. So back to this area of Western Australia, we see Drosera afordensis narrowly form from the tropical Kimberley. And I think this taxon is especially interesting because this is where Drosera ardensis occurs in close proximity with Drosera brevicornis, and they inhabit similar habitats that overlap at quite a few sites very extensively. So another beautiful form of this narrow leaf Drosera ardensis. So you see the petioles aren't quite as hairy, densely woolly as those we saw earlier from around Carnivorous in the eastern Kimberley, and instead we can see almost superficial resemblance to Drosera brevicornis in the hairs, as well as the general width of the petioles. Pedicels are often arranged in a linear column, pendulous to semi-erect. So this is not characteristic of Drosera ardensis and instead reflects brevicornis influence. So quite interesting, despite the rosettes clearly resembling Drosera ardensis. And you can find certain specimens in this region that do display more ardensis-esque pedicel morphology, although they are usually outnumbered by these specimens with pedicels usually longer, pedicels that are unusually short, as well as often somewhat pendulous. Pedicels are often reduced in length. So here on this specimen of the narrowleaf tropical Kimberley ardensis, we see pedicels that are shorter than the sepals. So very unusual, again, for ardensis, when you saw earlier the specimens with very strongly alternating, very long pedicels. Now here we see Drosera brevicornis from the Kimberley. It looks like Drosera brevicornis, but notably it is around much later it persists much later into the dry season than does Drosera derbiensis sensu stricto from the Northern Territory. And again, conversely, with Drosera brevicornis, we see that the pedicels are elongated, very much resembling Drosera ardensis. So we see this is very likely the result of gene flow between these two species. So where Drosera ardensis does not occur in Kakadu National Park and around Darwin, we do not see this. And where Drosera brevicornis does not occur around Carnivorous, the eastern Kimberley, which is the type region for ardensis, and where ardensis is the only described perennial Lasiocephala taxa, because technically Banksii was also collected there. We do not see this around that area. So, as I mentioned, the rosettes remain active much later into the dry season than Drosera brevicornis in the Northern Territory, which very much reflects Drosera ardensis influence. So, at last we are at the conclusion. I have thankfully finished in time. Apologies if the ending seemed a little bit rushed, but the very remote and harsh nature of Lasiocephala habitat makes research quite difficult. Many species of Drosera section Lasiocephala have yet to be discovered, and even more have yet to be described following, and I would like to emphasize, very much required additional in situ study. You may be able to pump out some crappy descriptions now, but we need, as I mentioned earlier, species coherence is largely maintained by ecology. And until we have a firm grasp of ecology, geography, because again, we don't really know the distributions of these species, and we don't know where one stops and another ends. So until we get out in the field exploring more, descriptions have the potential to be very, very poor, unless they are quite obviously different species. So I'm happy to answer questions as time permits. I would also enjoy collaborating on research with enthusiastic parties conducting fieldwork in the country of Australia. So if interested, you can contact me at an email I set up specifically, actually, for such of my Drosera expeditions, njuve@gmail.com. You can also find me on social media at Insects Inside Nursery or Insects Outside on Facebook and Instagram, as well as njuve on the iNaturalist. And I actually do upload a few of my photos on here. So you might be wondering at this point, what is this image? What is this image you are looking at? Well, this is my arm after sleeping in the remote northern area north of Colombo. It was right by a sandy beach for close to a week. So earlier this year, I spent 4 weeks, or I think more than 4 weeks, traveling around and living out of a rooftop tent on my camper vehicle. So in some of the most remote and actually beautiful areas of Northern Australia I've ever seen. And my mission was to rediscover, or one of my main primary objectives was to rediscover a very, very unusual taxon that will be published actually quite soon. And in order to do that, I was stationed in this region that had a very, very large quantity of midges. And every day I kept waking up and the midges continued to decimate my arms, and nothing I would do would save me against them. So this was near the end. It actually did get a bit worse than this, but near the end, my arms were just horrible, and all my arms, all my legs, well, both my arms, both my legs, just completely decimated by these midges. I would like to use this to illustrate that research in this region is not often a fun thing. It is just for the crazy individuals such as ourselves who do choose to subject ourselves to these oftentimes quite harsh and unfavorable conditions in the pursuit of new sundews. So with that, I would like to conclude the presentation, and I would like to again thank Kenny for hosting me, as well as my collaborators, including my good friend and colleague Thilo Kruger and Andreas Fleischmann to an extent.
Thank you so much, Noah. That was exciting and excellent, and I enjoyed your enthusiasm, and I'm sure it's going to rub off on a lot of other people. I just wanted to say a few things, and then if people who are attending this live have questions, you can type them into the chat. And Noah, I know you have at least one or two in there, so I'm going to read them in just a minute. But I wanted to remind people that if they become a paid ICPS member, a paid International Carnivorous Plant Society member, your donations and your memberships help us fund conservation and education initiatives. So one day soon, when Noah writes a grant proposal for the ICPS, we will have funding, but we only have funding if you donate or if you become a member. A benefit of becoming an ICPS member is you get access to our seed bank. This is a screenshot that I just took 45 minutes ago. You can see the prices. And then if you Depending on what country you live, you can send a message to our seed bank manager and he will let you know if he can send you carnivorous plant seeds. And the main benefit of being an ICPS member is our carnivorous plant newsletter, the CPN. We've been around for over 50 years. And when you become a member, you get access to the last 50 years of newsletters, which talk about field trip reports, discoveries, cultivation tips, and conservation news. This year, it was our fourth annual Carnivores in the Classroom grant, where we fund up to 50 teachers all over the world for carnivorous plants, because we want the young people of today to appreciate carnivorous plants. And I think having carnivorous plants in the classroom is a good way to hook them. These are the nurseries that supported that program, and Carnivorous is a program that designed 5 3D models of carnivorous plants. And if you have a 3D printer, you can print one for yourself for free. The 5th annual World Carnivorous Plant Day is coming up May 7th. And if you are interested, you can send me a email if you're interested in presenting. And part of World Carnivorous Plant Day is our photo contest. Noah, have you participated in the photo contest in the past?
I actually don't think I have yet, but I
Okay,
know
well,
that really good entries that I see every year.
okay, it's free and you can be a member of the ICPS, or you could just be somebody who follows our social media page. But if you go to carnivorousplants.org, we have the rules, and everyone gets to submit 5 photos for free. And there's different categories, and one of them is carnivorous plants in the wild. There's also carnivorous plants and people for a wacky thing. So, no, you could have a picture of you with your warts and your bites on your arms.
Yeah, the midge bites.
What is your opinion on the taxonomic coverage or changes and updates from Lowry's original 3 volumes to his later magnum opus volumes, and then the Red Fern 3-volume Drosera books? And can you have an answer that is 3 minutes or less?
Okay, so essentially with petiolaris complex Drosera, we are not synonymizing any species. We just need to add more species. Everything that has ever been described is currently accepted. You know, Drosera fulva at one point was synonymized with Drosera petiolaris, but then it got resurrected because it is obviously different. So in terms of the changes or any additional descriptions since that time, which would be, I think the only petiolaris complex Drosera in Lowry's time, which he did not participate in, was that of Drosera stipularis. And Alan Lowry emailed me that Drosera stipularis was not in cultivation because the people who described it were not true plant people. So that is a very Alan Lowry thing to say, of course. But yeah, I would be in full support of that all the descriptions since then. All known petiolaris complex Drosera are very valid species in my opinion, and there are many, many more out there. The number of undescribed petiolaris complex species is greater than the number of described ones. We just need more field research in that area. You can't look at a single herbarium specimen and determine and make an accurate assessment that this is new unless it is something extremely, extremely unusual. Like it's very difficult to tell out of that ecological context whether something is a natural hybrid or if you're looking at a completely distinct taxon.
All right, Matt Smith asked, how accessible are those habitats? Alan Lowry told me he had to use to fly in by helicopter for some of the more remote areas. And then Noah, I don't know if you know this, who now has Alan's field notes, and what are they doing with them? You happen to know that answer?
So I'm going to answer the first question first. Yes, the habitats are very remote. There are very few roads traveling up there. There's the Port Wander Road, there's the Gibb River Road, there's the Columba Road, and those are the only ones that are open during the during the dry season. or the only main roads that are open during the dry season, and they're completely closed during the wet season. So you can't see these plants at all during the wet season unless you have helicopter charter. So, and the majority of petiolaris complex Drosera grow and bloom during that wet season. So essentially, during the dry season, which is the worst time for seeing these plants, you can only go on 3 roads. I drove all those 3 roads. So I've seen most of what I can see without helicopter charter. My next trip, which will be taking place in approximately 1 year's time, is going to definitely involve helicopter charter, and will take place during the middle of the wet season. And I will be accessing these habitats from via helicopter charter, because otherwise it's impossible to get to new locations. And a lot of the times it's just driving this road, finding good habitat, and then walking off into the bush and finding the plants. So that's what I was doing for 4 weeks in Australia earlier last year.
And you loved it.
Yeah, it was a fantastic time.
All right. So thank you so much, Noah. And
yeah, thanks again. And thanks to everybody who watched. I hope you guys were able to understand my quite rapid speaking at times. And if not, you can always rewatch it on YouTube, which I'm confident that the ICPS will upload within the following days.
Yes, I will. And we'll conclude with Gavin saying, you got me into the petiolaris section, and now they're my favorite Drosera.
That is fantastic to hear. They are one of mine too.
It's not a surprise that gardeners, educators, and scientists are fascinated by these unique plants. The International Carnivorous Plant Society, or ICPS, not only love these plants, but welcomes growers just getting started all the way through professional scientists. The ICPS even started an annual World Carnivorous Plant Day to celebrate them. The free online event is held the first Wednesday of May. Take a look around our website and you'll find historic documents about carnivorous plants, growing guides, free educational resources, and more. Have questions? Ask. We don't bite, but our plants do.